I found my elderly 78-year-old mother frozen outside my own house while my in-laws celebrated Christmas inside as if they owned everything. What I did next completely destroyed their lives. I never thought I'd be the type of person to systematically ruin an entire family. But then again, I never thought I'd find my 78-year-old mother collapsed in a snowbank outside my own front door while my husband's family threw a Christmas party inside my house like they owned the place. Let me back up, because this story gets darker than you might expect. My name is Sarah, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had a pretty normal life. Married to David for 12 years, decent job as a paralegal, nice house in suburbia with a white picket fence and everything. Sure, his parents Margaret and Robert were challenging. Margaret had this way of rearranging my kitchen whenever she visited, always claiming she was just helping, while Robert treated me like I was some gold digger who'd trapped their precious son. But I figured that was just typical in-law stuff, right? Wrong. So incredibly, devastatingly wrong. The whole nightmare started on December 23rd. I was supposed to be home from my business trip by Christmas Eve, but my flight got delayed due to a massive snowstorm that had the entire Midwest locked down. When I called David to let him know I'd be stuck in Chicago for another day, he sounded weird. Distracted. Like he was whispering and trying not to be overheard. "Oh, that's too bad, honey," he said, but I could hear voices in the background. Laughter. Music. The clink of glasses. "Well, don't worry about rushing back. We'll just keep things low-key here." Low-key. That should have been my first red flag, because David's family doesn't do anything low-key. They're the type who turn a simple dinner into a production with place cards and coordinated napkins. "Are your parents there?" I asked, something cold settling in my stomach. "Yeah, they came by to check on your mom. You know how worried they get." Another lie. Margaret and Robert had never shown an ounce of concern for my mother since she'd moved in with us 2 months earlier after her fall. If anything, they'd made their displeasure crystal clear with passive-aggressive comments about disrupted routines and the burden of caregiving. But I was exhausted, stressed about the delayed client meeting, and honestly just wanted to get through the conversation. "Okay, well, give Mom my love. Tell her I'll be home tomorrow evening." "Sure thing. Love you." The line went dead before I could say it back. I managed to catch a red-eye that landed at 5:30 a.m. on Christmas Eve. The roads were terrible, thick with snow and ice, but I was determined to get home. I'd bought presents for everyone, including something special for Mom, a silk scarf in her favorite shade of blue that I'd found at a boutique in Chicago. I was excited to surprise them all with coffee and croissants from that bakery David loves downtown. Instead, I found my living room transformed into something I didn't recognize. Different furniture arranged in ways that made no sense. Different decorations, expensive-looking ones I'd never seen before. My family photos had been taken down and replaced with pictures of David's extended family. It was like walking into a parallel universe version of my own home, where I'd been completely erased. And then I heard it. My mother's voice, weak and desperate, calling from somewhere outside. "Sarah? Sarah, please. I'm so cold. Somebody help me." The coffee and pastries hit the floor as I ran to the front door. There she was, my tiny, frail mother, sitting in a snowbank beside my porch steps, wearing nothing but a thin nightgown and fuzzy slippers that were soaked through. Her lips were blue, almost purple. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely lift them. Ice crystals had formed in her gray hair. "Mom? Oh my word, what are you? How long have you been out here?" "Hours," she whispered through chattering teeth. Since last night. They wouldn't let me in. They said I didn't live here anymore. That this wasn't my home. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was molten, consuming, the kind of anger that makes your vision tunnel and your hands shake and your heart pound so hard you think it might explode. I scooped her up. She weighed nothing, just bones and papery skin and fragile hope, and carried her inside. That's when I heard the voices upstairs. Multiple voices. Laughing. Celebrating. The sound of champagne corks popping and someone playing piano. They were having a party. While my mother was dying of hypothermia 20 feet away. I got Mom wrapped in every blanket I could find and cranked the heat up as high as it would go. Her skin was like ice, and she kept drifting in and out of consciousness. I called 911, my voice surprisingly calm even though inside I was screaming. While we waited for the ambulance, she told me everything through chattering teeth that clicked like castanets. How she'd been living peacefully with us for the past 2 months, slowly recovering from her hip surgery, grateful for the company and the help. How yesterday morning, Margaret and Robert had shown up with suitcases and told David they were taking over Christmas because I was gone and someone needed to manage the household properly. How they'd spent the day rearranging everything, making phone calls, bringing in their own furniture from storage. How they'd invited a dozen of their friends over for what they called a proper Christmas celebration. How when my mother had asked where she should sleep, Margaret had actually laughed, and told her she wouldn't be sleeping there at all. They said I was disrupting the family dynamic, Mom whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. They said David agreed that it was time for me to find more appropriate accommodations. When I asked what that meant, they just opened the door and told me to figure it out. And David? Where was David during all this? Her face crumpled. He was there, sweetheart. He was standing right there. I kept looking at him, waiting for him to say something, to stick up for me. But he just looked at the floor and didn't say a word. The paramedics arrived and immediately started working on her. Hypothermia, they said. Dehydration? Possible frostbite on her toes. She was lucky to be alive, they said. Another hour or two and we'd be having a very different conversation. I rode with her to the hospital, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. She kept apologizing, as if any of this was her fault. As if she should be sorry for existing, for needing help, for trusting that her daughter's home would be a safe place. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she kept saying. "I didn't mean to cause trouble between you and David. Maybe I should have just gone to a hotel like they suggested." "Mom, stop. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. This is not your fault." But even as I said it, I could see the damage was already done. The confidence she'd been slowly rebuilding since her fall was shattered. The woman who'd raised 4 kids and run her own business for 30 years was apologizing for taking up space in the world. I stayed with her until the doctors said she was stable and would make a full recovery. Then I drove home through the early morning darkness with a plan forming in my head, a terrible, necessary, completely justified plan. The house was fully lit now, every window glowing warm and welcoming. Cars lined my driveway and spilled onto the street. I could hear music, laughter, the sound of a party in full swing. Through my kitchen window, I could see people I'd never met eating food from my refrigerator, drinking wine from my cabinet, using my good china that only came out for special occasions. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching them. Margaret was holding court at my dining table, gesturing dramatically with a glass of what looked like my expensive champagne, the bottle David and I had been saving for our anniversary. Robert was showing someone around my living room like he was a real estate agent giving a house tour. And David was right there with them. Smiling. Nodding. Playing the perfect host in my house, with my stuff, while my mother had been freezing to death outside. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. It was barely 6 a.m., but what I was planning couldn't wait for business hours. The first call was to my lawyer, Janet Morrison. We'd become friends over the years, working together on various cases, and she'd helped me with my mother's legal affairs when she first moved in. Janet was the type of lawyer who didn't mess around, sharp as a blade, ruthless when she needed to be, and available 24/7 for the right kind of case. She also had a personal hatred for elder abuse that went back to her own grandmother's experiences. "Sarah? It's Christmas Eve morning, Janet, I need to destroy some people," I said simply. "Are you interested in helping me do it legally?" After I explained the situation, there was a long pause. I could practically hear her lawyer brain spinning into high gear. "I'll be at my office in 2 hours. Bring documentation of everything, medical records, proof of residency, any financial documents related to your mother's care. And Sarah, don't do anything stupid before I see you." The second call was to my brother Mike, who'd left the police force 5 years ago to become a private investigator. Mike specialized in white-collar crime and had a particular talent for finding things people didn't want found. "Merry Christmas, sis. Isn't it a little early for, Mike, I need you to run a complete background check on Margaret and Robert Patterson. Financial records, criminal history, tax returns, everything you can dig up. And I need it fast. What did they do? After I explained, the line went quiet for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then, I'll have something for you by this afternoon. And Sarah? I'm sorry about Mom. That's unforgivable. The third call was to my cousin Lisa, who worked for the IRS and owed me about 15 favors from when I'd helped her through her divorce. The fourth was to my college roommate Rachel, who'd become a social worker specializing in elder abuse cases and worked closely with Adult Protective Services. By the time I was done making calls, I had a team assembled. And I had a strategy that would make Margaret and Robert wish they'd never heard my name. But first, I needed to get into my own house. I walked up to my front door and tried my key. It didn't work, they really had changed the locks on my own home. So I knocked. Politely. Like a visitor. Margaret answered, looking flushed and festive in a red silk dress I'd never seen before. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and she was wearing jewelry that definitely hadn't come from a department store. "Oh," she said, and her face felt like she'd seen a ghost. "Sarah. You're early." "It's my house, Margaret. I live here." "Well, yes, of course, but we're having a little gathering, and it's really not the best time. Where's my mother?" The guilt that flashed across her face was unmistakable, followed quickly by defensive irritation. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "The 78-year-old woman who's been living here for 2 months. My mother. Where is she?" "Oh, her." Margaret waved a dismissive hand, like we were discussing a piece of unwanted furniture. "She was getting a bit difficult. We thought it would be better if she found other arrangements for the holidays. Less stressful for everyone involved." "Other arrangements? Like freezing to death on my porch." "I see. And who exactly gave you permission to make that decision about my mother in my house?" "Well, David and I discussed it, and we felt." "David?" I called past her, loud enough for the whole house to hear. "Come here, please. Your wife wants to talk to you." The music stopped. Conversations faltered. I could hear footsteps on the stairs, murmured voices, the sound of a party grinding to an uncomfortable halt. David appeared in the hallway behind Margaret, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. Guilt. Fear. Shame. The expression of a man who knew he'd crossed a line he could never uncross, made a choice he could never unmake. "Hi, honey," he said weakly, not quite meeting my eyes. "I thought you weren't coming back until this evening." Plans changed. Funny how that happens. Just like apparently a lot of things changed while I was gone. I pushed past Margaret into my own living room, taking in the scene with fresh eyes. About 15 people I'd never met, all dressed in expensive clothes, all looking extremely uncomfortable now. My furniture had been pushed against the walls or removed entirely. A massive Christmas tree dominated the corner where my mother's hospital bed had been set up. The tree was decorated with ornaments I didn't recognize, crystal and gold, the kind that cost more than most people spend on groceries. "Nice tree," I said conversationally. "Where's Mom's stuff?" We put it in storage," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Without asking me. "Sarah, you're clearly upset, but if we could just talk about this privately." "No." My voice came out sharper than I intended, carrying across the silent room. "I think we should talk about this right here, in front of everyone. I think your parents' friends should hear about how you threw a sick, elderly woman out of her home on Christmas Eve." A woman in pearls gasped softly. A man in an expensive suit suddenly found his drink very interesting. The room went completely silent except for the soft crackle of the fire in the fireplace, my fireplace, burning my wood. Robert stepped forward then, his chest puffed out like a rooster ready for a fight. He'd clearly had a few drinks, and his face was red with righteous indignation. "Now see here, young lady. That woman was disrupting our family time. David has been under tremendous stress trying to manage both a career and caregiving duties. We simply thought it would be better for everyone if she found more suitable accommodations." "Suitable accommodations," I repeated slowly. "Like a snowbank?" We suggested several very nice facilities. At 9 o'clock at night. On Christmas Eve. In a blizzard. We assumed she would go to a hotel. With what money, Robert? She's living on Social Security. Do you know what hotels cost on Christmas Eve? Margaret stepped closer to her husband, and I could see they'd prepared for this confrontation. They had their stories straight, their justifications lined up. They'd convinced themselves they were the victims here. "Sarah, you're being dramatic," Margaret said with fake calm. "No one forced her to sit outside. She chose not to find alternative arrangements." "She chose not to find alternative arrangements," I repeated, my voice deadly quiet. A 78-year-old woman with a recent hip surgery, wearing a nightgown, in the snow. She chose that. If she had called around, I'm sure she could have found something. She doesn't have a phone, Margaret. You know that. Her cell phone was destroyed in her fall, and we haven't replaced it yet because she's been living here safely. The silence stretched out, thick with tension and growing horror as the party guests began to understand what they'd wandered into. "Look," David said desperately, "let's just—" "No," I cut him off. "Let's talk about this. Let's talk about how you changed the locks on my house without telling me. How you threw away my mother's belongings without asking. How you turned my home into your personal party venue while a vulnerable elderly woman sat outside in the cold for hours." "It's David's house too," Margaret said defensively. "He has just as much right to make decisions about who lives here." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "he doesn't. This house is in my name only. I bought it 2 years before we got married with money from my grandmother's estate. Which means what you did last night wasn't just elder abuse and illegal eviction, it was also breaking and entering." I showed them the photo I'd taken of the deed years ago when I'd organized our important documents. Margaret's face went white. Robert's mouth fell open. David looked like he was going to be sick. That's not possible," Margaret stammered. "David said he was a co-owner. David said what he needed to say to make you feel better about what you were planning. But the paperwork doesn't lie." I turned to face the room full of strangers who were looking increasingly desperate to escape. "I'm sorry, everyone, but this party is over. You're going to need to leave my house immediately." Most of them couldn't get out fast enough. Apparently, witnessing a family implode wasn't their idea of holiday entertainment. Within 10 minutes, it was just me, David, and his parents, standing in the wreckage of what used to be my living room. "Sarah, please," David said, reaching for my arm. "Let's just calm down and work this out like adults." I jerked away from him. "Calm down? David, I found my mother unconscious in a snowbank. She has hypothermia. She could have died. But she didn't, because I came home 12 hours early. What if I hadn't? What if I'd stayed in Chicago like I planned? What if my flight hadn't been rescheduled? Would you have just let her freeze to death out there?" The silence was answer enough. "Get out," I said quietly. "All of you. Get out of my house right now." "Sarah, you can't be serious," Margaret said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "It's Christmas Eve. We have nowhere to go. All of our friends just left. You can't just throw us out onto the street." The irony was so thick you could choke on it. "You should have thought of that before you threw my mother onto the street." "That's completely different." "How? How is it different, Margaret?" "We'll get a hotel," Robert said, taking his wife's arm with as much dignity as he could muster. "Come on, dear. David, you're coming with us." But David hesitated, looking between his parents and me with obvious torment. "Sarah, this is my home too. We're married. We need to talk about this." "No," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "We really don't. Take whatever you need for tonight. We'll discuss the rest later. You can't just kick me out." "I can, and I am. You made your choice, David. You chose them over my mother. Over me. Over basic human decency. Now live with the consequences." After they left, dragging their suitcases and their wounded pride, I sat in my destroyed living room and cried. Not just from anger, though there was plenty of that. Not just from betrayal, though the pain of David's choices cut deeper than I'd expected. I cried from the sheer overwhelming grief of it all. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision or a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. This was planned. Calculated. They'd been plotting this for who knows how long, waiting for the perfect opportunity to get rid of the inconvenient old woman and claim what they thought was theirs. My phone rang at 8 a.m. "Janet." I'm at the office with coffee and a very bad attitude. How did the confrontation go? They're gone for now. Did you find anything? Oh, Sarah. I found so much more than anything. You need to get down here right now. Janet's office was in one of those sleek downtown buildings that screamed expensive legal power. Even on Christmas Eve, she looked perfectly put together in a tailored suit and her signature red lipstick. She had files spread across her enormous conference table and a pot of coffee that smelled like salvation. Sit down, she said without preamble. This is going to take a while, and you're going to want to be sitting for most of it. What she found in just 3 hours of digging was staggering. It turned out Margaret and Robert hadn't just been planning the Christmas takeover, they'd been orchestrating something much bigger and more sinister. They've been trying to get your mother declared legally incompetent, Janet said, sliding a thick folder across to me. Look at this. Medical records from doctors I'd never heard of. Legal documents I'd never seen. Applications for emergency guardianship that had been filed without my knowledge. A paper trail going back 6 weeks, all building toward the same goal, taking control of my mother's life and assets. They wanted to have her committed to a nursing home, Janet continued, her voice tight with professional outrage. Permanently. And they wanted David appointed as her legal guardian, which would give them control over her Social Security benefits, her savings account, and the proceeds from selling her house. My hands started shaking as I flipped through the documents. But she's not incompetent. She's recovering from a fall, but she's sharp as ever. She does crossword puzzles every morning and reads 3 books a week. I know. But they've been shopping for doctors who would say otherwise. Look at this consultation report. It was from a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Harold Brennan, someone I'd never heard of. A detailed report claiming my mother showed signs of severe dementia, memory loss, and posed a danger to herself and others. Complete fabrication from start to finish. How is this legal? It's not. It's fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and probably a dozen other charges. But that's just the beginning. Janet pulled out another folder, this one even thicker. Your brother found some very interesting things about their personal finances. Mike's investigation had revealed that Margaret and Robert were in serious financial trouble. Their house, the house they'd been so proud of, the house they'd lorded over us during every family gathering, was 3 months behind on mortgage payments and facing foreclosure. Robert had lost over $200,000 in cryptocurrency investments he'd hidden from Margaret. They'd maxed out 6 credit cards and taken cash advances to cover minimum payments on others. They needed your mother's money, Janet said. Desperately. And I think they were planning to force David to divorce you after they got control of your mother's assets and could claim half of this house. The room spun a little. Divorce me? Think about it. If they could prove your mother was incompetent and get David appointed as her guardian, they could move her to a state facility and sell her house. The proceeds would go into an account David controlled. Then, if David divorced you and claimed financial hardship from caregiving duties, he could potentially get awarded half the value of this house in the settlement. But that would never work. Maybe not completely, but it would give them access to hundreds of thousands of dollars while tying you up in legal battles for years. Even if they ultimately lost, they'd have bought themselves time and money to solve their financial crisis. And David? He couldn't have known all this. He's not that calculating. Janet's expression was sympathetic but firm. Sarah, David signed most of these documents. He met with Dr. Brennan. He filed the guardianship petition. He knew. The betrayal hit me all over again, deeper this time. This wasn't just about Christmas. This wasn't just about my mother being inconvenient. This was about my entire life being systematically dismantled by people I'd trusted, people I'd loved, people I'd welcomed into my home and my heart. What can we do? Legally? We can do quite a lot. I've already drafted criminal complaints for elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft. But Sarah, I need to know how far you want to take this. Because once we start this process, there's no going back. I thought about my mother, shivering in that snowbank. I thought about the fear in her eyes, the way she'd apologized for existing, for being inconvenient, for trusting that her daughter's home would be safe. I thought about David's face when he tried to justify abandoning her, when he'd stood there and let his parents destroy an innocent woman for money. All the way, I said. I want to take this all the way to the end. The next 72 hours were a blur of legal motions, police reports, and phone calls that would have made a prosecutor jealous. Janet worked like a woman possessed, filing charges faster than I could keep track of them. Elder abuse in the first degree. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Attempted theft by deception. Illegal eviction. Breaking and entering. Mike dug deeper into Robert and Margaret's finances and found a trail of deception that went back years. Falsified tax returns. Insurance claims for accidents that never happened. A consulting business that existed only on paper but had been claiming deductions for 5 years. Rachel documented the abuse and neglect my mother had suffered, taking photos of her frostbitten toes, recording her testimony about the verbal threats Margaret had made. She also connected us with Adult Protective Services, who opened their own investigation. Lisa, my cousin at the IRS, was particularly helpful once she saw the evidence of tax fraud. It turned out Robert had been claiming business deductions for his fake consulting company while also collecting unemployment benefits he wasn't entitled to. They owed the federal government over $80,000 in back taxes and penalties. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source, David himself. 3 days after Christmas, he showed up at my door looking like he hadn't slept or showered since I'd kicked him out. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had the desperate look of a man whose world was falling apart. "Sarah, please. I need to talk to you. We have nothing to discuss. Call my lawyer. I know how this looks, but you don't understand the whole situation. I understand enough. You tried to steal my mother's money and throw her away when she became inconvenient. That's not what happened." His voice cracked with desperation. "I never wanted any of this. I tried to stop them. By signing legal documents? By changing the locks on my house? That's how you stopped them?" He ran his hands through his hair, and for a moment I saw the man I'd married, confused, overwhelmed, making terrible choices but not fundamentally evil. Then I remembered my mother's blue lips and the sympathy evaporated. "My parents. They're not who you think they are. They've been lying to everyone, including me. They're broke, Sarah. Completely broke. They've been hiding it for months, and when your mom moved in, they saw an opportunity. To steal from her. To solve their problems, yes. But Sarah, they told me if I didn't help them, they'd make your mother's life miserable anyway. They threatened to have her declared incompetent and put in the worst possible facility. I thought if I went along with part of their plan, I could control the rest. I could make sure she ended up somewhere safe. So you decided that for her. Without asking her. Without asking me. I was trying to protect her. By throwing her outside in the snow?" His face crumpled. "I didn't know they were going to do that. I swear, Sarah, I didn't know. I thought they'd arranged a hotel room. When I found out she'd been outside all night, I was sick. Physically sick." I stared at him, trying to find some trace of the man I'd once loved in this desperate stranger. "But you didn't come looking for her. You didn't call me. You just kept partying." I was scared. I knew I'd made a terrible mistake, but I didn't know how to fix it without making everything worse. "So you chose to do nothing?" "I chose wrong. I chose wrong about everything, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But Sarah, please, you have to believe me, I never wanted to hurt your mother. I love her too." I almost believed him. For just a moment, looking at his broken face and hearing the genuine anguish in his voice, I almost believed that this had all been a horrible mistake, a series of bad choices made with good intentions. Then I remembered the legal documents Janet had shown me, all bearing David's signature. The guardianship petition filed weeks before I'd left for Chicago. The consultation with Dr. Brennan that David had scheduled himself. "If that's true," I said quietly, "then you can prove it by telling the authorities everything you know about your parents' plans." His face went pale. "Sarah, they're still my parents. And she's still my mother. The mother you left outside to die. I can't testify against them. I can't send my own parents to prison." And there it was. When forced to choose, even now, even after everything, David was still choosing his parents over my mother. Over me. Over basic human decency. "Then we have nothing more to talk about," I said, and closed the door in his face. The first domino fell in February. Robert was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of tax evasion, unemployment fraud, and conspiracy. The local newspaper ran the story with a headline that must have made Margaret physically ill: local man charged in elder abuse scheme. The second domino fell a week later when Margaret was arrested for disability fraud. It turned out she'd been collecting payments for a back injury that had supposedly left her unable to work, while simultaneously running a catering business under her maiden name. The irony wasn't lost on anyone: she'd been claiming disability while physically abusing a truly disabled elderly woman. The third domino was David. He was formally charged with elder abuse, conspiracy, and fraud in March. By then, the media had picked up the story, and it was making national news as an example of how family members prey on vulnerable elderly relatives. But the biggest victory came when Janet called me in late March with news that made everything worthwhile. "They want a plea bargain," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "All of them. Robert and Margaret are looking at serious prison time, and David's lawyer thinks the only way to avoid jail is full cooperation and restitution." "What kind of restitution?" "Full payment of your mother's medical bills, including ongoing therapy. Compensation for pain and suffering, we're talking 6 figures. David wants to sign over any claim to this house, and both parents want to surrender any future claims to your mother's estate." I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired. "What do you think I should do?" "That depends. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge?" It was a good question, one I'd been wrestling with for months. Justice would be seeing them held accountable, making sure they could never hurt anyone else the way they'd hurt my mother. Revenge would be pushing for maximum penalties, dragging everything out in court, making them suffer as much as possible. But what I really wanted was for my mother to be safe. I wanted her to know that what happened to her mattered, that someone had fought for her, that she was valued and protected. And I wanted to move on with my life. "I want to make sure they can never do this to anyone else," I said finally. "And I want my mother to have the security and care she deserves." We accepted the plea deals, but not without conditions. Robert got 18 months in federal prison plus 5 years of probation. Margaret got 12 months and 7 years of probation, with the requirement that she perform 500 hours of community service at a nursing home, a particularly fitting touch that Janet suggested. David got probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and a permanent restraining order keeping him away from my mother and me. He also had to surrender his share of our joint accounts and retirement funds, money that went directly into a trust for my mother's care. The divorce was finalized in June. I kept the house, obviously, along with everything in it. David kept his car and his personal belongings. Everything else was liquidated to pay restitution and legal fees. My mother moved back in with me permanently, and we turned her room into exactly what it should have been from the beginning: a safe, comfortable space for her to recover and live with dignity. We installed grab bars in the bathroom, got her a medical alert system, and set up a reading nook by the window where she could watch the birds in our garden. She started physical therapy and slowly regained her strength and confidence. She joined a book club at the library, made friends at the senior center, even started volunteering at a local literacy program. Most importantly, she stopped apologizing for existing. But the story doesn't end there, because in cases like this, it never really ends cleanly. In August, 6 months after the plea deals were finalized, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I'd been getting a lot of media requests and angry calls from David's extended family. I answered. "Sarah?" A woman's voice, shaky and weak. "This is Margaret." My blood went cold. She was violating her restraining order just by calling me. "How did you get this number?" "Please, don't hang up. I need to talk to you. I need you to know the truth. We have nothing to talk about. You're violating your restraining order by calling me." "I'm dying," she said simply. "Cancer. Stage 4. I have maybe 6 weeks left." I almost hung up anyway. Almost. But something in her voice, a resignation, a finality, stopped me. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "But I still don't know why you're calling me." "Because I need you to know the truth about David. About all of it. I already know the truth." "No, you don't." She was crying now, the kind of deep, painful sobs that come from somewhere beyond regret. David never wanted any of this. He tried to stop us. We made him choose between us and you, and we told him terrible things would happen if he didn't help us. My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of terrible things? We told him if he didn't cooperate, we'd make sure your mother ended up in the worst possible nursing home. We told him we'd make her life so miserable she'd beg to die. We told him we had connections, people who could make an old woman's life very unpleasant. The room seemed to tilt. You're lying. I'm dying, Sarah. What would be the point of lying now? We were desperate. Robert had lost so much money, and we were going to lose everything. When your mother moved in, we saw her as a solution. But David kept refusing to help us. So you threatened her. We told him we knew people. Orderlies who could be careless with medications. Nurses who might forget to check on patients. We made him believe we could make her suffer if he didn't cooperate. Her voice broke completely. We manipulated our own son with threats against an innocent old woman. I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. But he still signed the documents. He was trying to protect her, Sarah. In his twisted logic, if he went along with part of our plan, he could control the rest. He could make sure she ended up somewhere safe, somewhere we couldn't reach her. He didn't know we were planning to just abandon her outside. He thought we'd arranged a hotel room. You're telling me David was trying to save her? He was trying to choose the lesser evil. We'd convinced him that no matter what, we were going to find a way to get control of your mother's assets. We made him believe the only choice was between helping us do it gently or watching us do it viciously. I hung up without another word. For 3 days, I couldn't sleep. Margaret's words haunted me, picking at the careful story I'd constructed about David's betrayal. I'd been so sure of his guilt, so certain that he'd chosen greed over love. But what if I'd been wrong? What if the man I destroyed was actually trying to protect my mother in the only way he thought possible? I called Janet and told her about the conversation. Is there any way to verify this? I asked. Let me make some calls. Confidentially, off the record. 6 hours later, she called back with information that turned my world upside down again. I talked to David's lawyer. Confidentially, as officers of the court. Margaret's telling the truth, at least partially. David did try to back out the day before you came home. There was a huge fight. Margaret threatened to make the old woman disappear permanently if he didn't cooperate. But he still went through with it. Sarah, I also talked to the hotel manager where Robert and Margaret were staying after you kicked them out. David had made a reservation for your mother at that same hotel, paid for a week in advance, arranged for handicap accessibility. He thought his parents were going to take her there after you left for work the next day. The room spun around me. What? He was trying to minimize the damage. In his mind, your mother would be safe and comfortable at the hotel until you got back, and then you two could figure out a permanent solution together. He had no idea they were planning to just leave her outside. I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the garden my mother had started planting. She was out there now, carefully tending tomatoes and roses, humming to herself, looking stronger and happier than she had in months. Did it matter why David had done what he did? Did good intentions excuse the outcome? Did it change the fact that my mother had nearly died because of choices he'd made? But it also didn't change the legal documents he'd signed weeks earlier, the consultation with the fraudulent doctor, the guardianship petition that would have stripped my mother of her autonomy. I spent hours trying to reconcile these two versions of events. David the calculating conspirator and David the manipulated son trying to protect an elderly woman from his own parents' threats. Both stories had evidence. Both felt true. Maybe that was the real tragedy, that good people could make terrible choices when trapped between impossible options. That love and fear could twist together until you couldn't tell them apart. I never called David. I never called Margaret back before she died 6 weeks later. I didn't attend her funeral, but I sent flowers, white lilies, because I didn't know what else to do with the complicated grief I felt for a woman who'd nearly killed my mother but might have been more desperate than evil. Robert served his full sentence and moved to Arizona to live with his sister afterward. As far as I know, he never contacted any of us again. Sometimes I wonder if he understood what they'd really done, or if he still thinks they were justified. David left town 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I heard from mutual friends that he'd moved to Oregon and gotten a job with a nonprofit that helps elderly people navigate legal issues and avoid financial exploitation. Maybe that was his way of making amends. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was still the man I'd once loved, just someone who'd made catastrophically wrong choices under impossible pressure. Or maybe I was just telling myself a story that made the destruction of my marriage feel less like a tragedy and more like a necessity. It's been 3 years now since that Christmas Eve. My mother is thriving in ways I hadn't dared hope for. She's made close friends at the senior center, joined a competitive Scrabble league, started taking watercolor painting classes. She volunteers at the library twice a week, teaching literacy to adults, and has become something of a local celebrity for her stories about growing up during the Depression. She never mentions David or his parents. Not once in 3 years. When people ask about my divorce, she changes the subject with the skill of someone who's learned that some topics are too painful to revisit. But sometimes I catch her looking at their wedding photos that I never got around to taking down, and I see something in her eyes, sadness, maybe, or regret for the family that might have been. I've started dating again, carefully and slowly. There's a man named Tom who works at the bookstore downtown, someone who brings my mother first edition mysteries and discusses Agatha Christie plots with the seriousness of a literary scholar. He's patient with my questions about his family, understanding about the background checks I run on anyone who gets close to us, gentle with the walls I've built around my heart. Trust is earned, he told me recently. And some people earn it faster than others. I'm willing to take as long as you need. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far in my quest for justice. If I should have found a way to handle things that didn't result in prison sentences and ruined lives. If I should have been more understanding, more forgiving, more willing to believe that people could change. But then I remember my mother's blue lips in the snow. I remember the fear in her eyes, the way she'd apologize for existing, for being inconvenient, for trusting that her daughter's home would be safe. I remember that if I hadn't come home early, if I'd trusted David's reassurances and stayed in Chicago as planned, she might have died out there while they celebrated inside. And I know that some things are unforgivable. Some lines, once crossed, change everything forever. Did I destroy their lives? Yes. Absolutely. Completely. Do I regret it? That's the question that keeps me awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling and trying to untangle the complicated web of love and justice and revenge that defined those terrible months. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that people I'd loved and trusted were capable of such cruelty, such calculated indifference to human suffering. I regret that my mother had to experience that kind of betrayal and abandonment. I regret that David was put in an impossible position, forced to choose between his parents' threats and his conscience. But do I regret stopping them? Do I regret making sure they faced consequences for what they did? Do I regret prioritizing my mother's safety over my marriage, her dignity over their comfort, justice over forgiveness? No. Not for a second. Because here's what I learned that Christmas Eve, sitting in my destroyed living room with my heart breaking and my mother fighting hypothermia, sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who will hurt you the worst. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to become someone you never thought you could be. Sometimes you have to be willing to destroy everything to save what matters most. My mother is safe now. She's happy, healthy, surrounded by people who value her for who she is rather than what she owns. She never has to apologize for existing again, never has to worry that the people who claim to love her are actually calculating how to exploit her. That's worth everything I had to become to make it happen. Even if it means I'll never be quite the same person I was before I found her in the snow. Even if it means I'll always wonder whether the man I loved was a victim or a villain, whether justice and revenge are really different things, whether destroying people who hurt the innocent makes you a hero or just another person willing to cross lines when the stakes are high enough. But late at night, when the doubts creep in and I question every choice I made, I walk past my mother's room and hear her humming softly to herself as she reads, content and secure and completely unaware of the darkness she survived. And I know I'd do it all again. Every single destructive, necessary, unforgivable thing. Because some people are worth fighting for, even if it costs you everything you thought you were. Especially then.